You ever notice how some families don't appear anywhere in the historical record, and yet somehow their shadows stretch across every generation you've ever known? Tonight, I'm going to tell you about one of them, a family the world wasn't meant to see, a family whose name was spoken only in courtrooms, whispered in hospital corridors, or carved into the soft wood of rural coffins before the dirt swallowed the truth. But the story didn't begin with tragedy. It began with silence. A silence so complete it made grown men forget what they were about to say, and made children wake in the night with the sense that someone was standing at their door, breathing the same air, waiting for a moment that never came. Most families leave behind photographs, records, stories. This one left behind patterns, recurring dates, identical birthmarks passed from father to son like warnings. Year after year, county after county, you see the same thing: a February birth followed by an October disappearance, a sudden inheritance, a burned-out farmhouse, a police report that ends with the same sentence: no further action taken. Not for lack of evidence, but because the evidence was always the same, always too familiar. It was as if the truth was trying to speak through the decades, only to be suffocated before it reached the surface. When I first found the files, I wasn't looking for them. They were buried in a mislabeled box in a courthouse basement outside Lexington, dust sealing the lid like a protective spell. The clerk didn't want to unlock the door. He said the last person who'd requested that box left the building without saying a word, walked straight into the parking lot, and drove until his headlights dissolved into the hills. Never came back for his briefcase. Inside were newspaper clippings with the photographs ripped out, medical charts with entire pages removed, marriage certificates stamped VO'd though the weddings had taken place. There was even a family tree, hand-drawn, the ink faded and trembling. But every name above the year 1903 was scratched out in the same violent stroke, as if someone had taken a blade and dragged it straight through the bloodline. And at the top of the pile was a single sheet so worn it looked almost transparent. On it someone had written 7 words, no signature, no date, just a warning or a confession. They were not meant to stay among us. The more I read, the more I understood why no one ever finishes this story. Because the family didn't just vanish. They were removed, and the reason why is the part that was never meant to be heard. You would think a family could simply disappear through bad luck, misfortune, or the slow erosion of poverty, but that's not what happened here. The deeper I went into those files, the clearer it became that this bloodline didn't dissolve, it was erased with intention, as if someone or something had been tracking them for far longer than any official document admitted. And the strangest part wasn't what I found. It was what kept finding me. It started with the birth certificates. They were all handwritten until 1947, then abruptly switched to typewritten forms except for this family. Their records remained handwritten even into the late 70s, long after the rest of the county standardized everything. Each certificate had the same strange note in the margin, scrawled in barely legible pencil. Subject examined. No doctor's initials, no state stamp, just those 2 words. It gave the impression that someone outside the medical system, someone unaccountable, inspected each newborn before allowing the record to enter the county files. Then there were the disappearances. Local newspapers treated them like mundane tragedies, a farm accident, a winter storm, a hunting mishap. But every so-called accident ended the same way: the body was never recovered, and the surrounding area was sealed off for valuation. Evaluation by who? None of the clippings said. The sheriff's office refused to comment, and the families, the cousins, the in-laws, the neighbors, they stayed quiet, not out of fear, but out of obligation, almost like they'd been taught not to question what happened to those people, because questioning it meant acknowledging something that didn't fit inside ordinary American life. And I kept returning to the marriage certificates, the ones stamped VOID. Every voided marriage involved someone entering the family, not someone leaving it. It was as if the county refused to legally acknowledge anyone who tried to join that bloodline. But the strangest detail was this: each voided certificate listed the same witness, a witness no one ever seemed to have met. The name was so common it should have appeared everywhere in public records, yet it didn't show up once outside of these documents. No address, no obituary, no property owned, just a ghost signing the edges of a family that was being watched, catalogued, and, slowly, cut off from the rest of the country. That's when it dawned on me. This wasn't a curse, it wasn't superstition. It was a controlled dismantling of an entire lineage. But the question still hung in the air, cold and heavy. What had this family done to deserve removal? By the time I reached the custody records, I realized I wasn't looking at a family history. I was looking at a containment strategy. Nearly every child born into this bloodline after 1922 had some kind of state involvement, though never the same department twice. One case was labeled Department of Agriculture, another Department of Interior, another simply Department 7 with no explanation. Not child services, not local law enforcement, but agencies that handled land, resources, and, in rare cases, classified environmental matters. It made no sense on the surface unless the children themselves were considered something other than citizens, something closer to assets or hazards. The notes describing the children were even stranger. They didn't mention behavior or health. Instead, they listed measurements no normal doctor would care about: clavicle density, peripheral vision testing in total darkness, unusual pain thresholds. One child was recorded as holding his breath for an inconclusive duration. Another was described as having a calm response to fatal stimulus, though the file never clarified what that meant. There were no signatures, only coded initials, combinations that didn't match any staff rosters from that era. But the detail that stopped me cold was a single line buried in a 1939 file. Specimen does not appear aware of deviation. The word specimen burned through the page. Deviation from what? Awareness of what? Whatever they believed this family carried, it wasn't something visible. It was something observed only by those who knew exactly how to look. I started tracking the geography next. Every generation of this family had been relocated at least once. Not moved, relocated. The files used that word every time. Always rural, always isolated, always near water sources with no public access. It was as if they needed the family contained within natural boundaries, rivers, marshlands, reservoirs with restricted shorelines, places where anyone trying to enter or leave would be noticed long before they reached safety. Yet with all this surveillance, all this control, there were still anomalies. Children who slipped through the cracks. Adults who left home unexpectedly. One file noted a man who exhibited auditory recognition before scheduled assessment. They moved him 3 counties away overnight. No forwarding address, no follow-up. And through all these decades, through all these relocations and examinations, not one official ever mentioned the family by name. They referred to them only as the line. Not a family, a line. A lineage monitored like something dangerous that needed to be kept from spreading. And in the margins of one file, almost erased by time, were 4 more words: traits emerging, not stable. When I read that, I finally understood why the county clerk didn't want me seeing these boxes. Because this wasn't about one haunted family in a forgotten corner of America. This was about what that family was becoming. The first real break in the pattern came from a box that wasn't supposed to be there at all. It was thinner than the others, bound with twine instead of tape, and marked with a code I couldn't trace to any department. 3 letters, 2 numbers, and a symbol I'd only ever seen in military archives from experiments that were later disavowed. Inside were just 2 files. Both belonged to individuals who should never have lived past childhood, according to the other records. But not only had they lived into adulthood, they'd been studied in ways that crossed every ethical boundary America claimed to uphold. The first file belonged to a woman born in 1952. Her early records mirrored the others: strange measurements, frequent relocations, notes about limited public access. But everything changed when she turned 20. A single report noted that she demonstrated retention beyond acceptable limits. No explanation of what she retained. The next page described her as aware of observation, something the other files made clear was not supposed to happen. Because for nearly a century, this family's defining trait wasn't what they could do, but what they didn't know. They weren't aware of the monitoring. They weren't aware of their own differences. They weren't aware they were being contained. But she was, and the consequences came swiftly. 2 relocations in a single month. 3 agencies reporting conflicting findings. 1 note, stamped in red, read, "Do not allow contact with siblings." Yet the file ended without any record of her death, disappearance, or transfer. It just stopped. Like someone removed the last pages, or like her story didn't end in a way the department could document without raising alarms. The second file was even more disturbing. It belonged to her brother, born 3 years later. His records included the usual examinations, until a sudden 6-year gap appeared. No notes, no locations, nothing. When the documentation resumed, he was living under a different surname in a different state, with different guardians. The report said he had been placed there as a test case. A test for what? Whether he could blend in, whether he could be absorbed into the world without the lineage resurfacing. His teachers described him as highly perceptive, but emotionally flat. A neighbor said he spent long hours sitting by the river behind the house, staring at the water without blinking. One social worker wrote a line that sent a chill through me the moment I read it. When he looks at you, he seems to be listening for something you cannot hear. The file ended with a timestamp of a home visit that never took place. The social worker arrived at the residence to find the house empty. No signs of struggle, no packed bags, nothing missing except the boy's shoes, as if he'd simply walked out barefoot into the woods. The final annotation read, "Presumed return to origin." Not return home, return to origin, like he belonged to something older than the family itself, something still waiting for him. And that's when it became clear that whatever had marked this bloodline, it didn't weaken over generations. It evolved. By the time I reached the bottom of the stack, I realized there were no more official documents left to examine, only what people had tried to hide. Personal letters, unsigned notes, pages torn from journals that looked like they'd been burned at the edges, as if someone had tried to destroy them but couldn't quite bring themselves to finish the job. These scraps weren't meant for the public record. They were confessions written by people who had lived with the family, people who had watched something shift inside the bloodline long before the government ever took interest. One letter, dated 1964, was written by a midwife who delivered 3 children from the lineage over her lifetime. Her handwriting shook, like the words themselves terrified her. She wrote that the children were born too quietly, that they entered the world as if they already understood the terms. She said none of them cried at birth. Not one. She claimed it wasn't the silence that frightened her. It was the way they looked at her, as if their eyes were older than their faces. She described a sensation of being recognized, even though she had never met them before. Another note came from a schoolteacher who worked in a rural district where the family had been relocated in the late 70s. She wrote that 2 siblings in her class had a strange habit. They never answered questions immediately. They paused, like they were waiting for permission from someone she couldn't see. When she mentioned it to the parents, they refused to discuss it. But the teacher's last line was the most unsettling of all. When they finally speak, they always give the answer you were already thinking, even if you haven't said it yet. But the fragment that unsettled me the most was not from a stranger. It was from one of the family members themselves. A torn journal page, undated, written in a steady hand that seemed far too calm for the content. The writer talked about growing up with a constant sense of being watched, not by the government, but by something older, something that didn't need laws or agencies to enforce boundaries. They described dreams of standing in fields they had never visited, hearing whispers in a language no one in their county could speak, and they wrote about a moment when they realized the truth. It's not that someone is following us. It's that something is waiting for us to return. That line stayed with me, because it suggested the government wasn't trying to suppress the family out of fear that they would harm others, but out of fear that something would eventually come looking for them. Something that wasn't supposed to cross into our world. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The last box shouldn't have existed. It wasn't on any inventory list, not taped shut, not even hidden. It was simply sitting there on the concrete floor, as if someone had placed it down moments before I arrived. No dust on the lid, no label, no attempt to disguise what it was. That alone told me it contained what the others refused to say outright. The cardboard was soft from age, but the contents inside were preserved with unsettling care. Plastic sleeves, archival envelopes, and a stack of audio transcripts stamped with a department name I will not repeat here. The first transcript documented an interview with a man identified only as Subject 43, a member of the lineage who had survived into his 40s, something almost unheard of in the other records. His answers were brief, emotionless. Each question was about perception, what he heard in silence, what he sensed in total darkness, what he dreamed when he slept near running water. At first the responses seemed ordinary. Then the pattern changed. He stopped answering the questions being asked and began answering questions the interviewers hadn't spoken aloud. The transcript notes the investigators' confusion, then their fear. The session ended abruptly after one officer left the room and did not return. His badge and recorder were found the next morning on the floor outside the building, facing the woods. The second transcript was worse. It chronicled a midnight interview with a woman who had been relocated 10 times in 7 years. The investigators noted that she appeared disoriented, but her speech was calm. She said she didn't understand why they kept moving her. She said she didn't know what the others wanted from her. When the interviewer asked who they were, she smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, but knowingly. She said, "Not all families start here." The rest of the page was redacted, but one phrase survived in the margin, scrawled in pen by someone who wasn't supposed to leave notes. Her voice changed, not her words, her voice. Then there were the photographs, not of people, of locations, streams, dead-end trails, open fields with nothing remarkable except the feeling that you should not step into them. One photo showed a bend in a river with a black smudge at the shoreline. At first I thought it was just an old stain, but under magnification, the smudge had shape. Not a person, not an animal, something narrow, elongated, and impossibly still, like a shadow cast by something that wasn't standing there anymore. The final page in the box was a memo, no signature, no date, just a message written in a voice that understood the weight of what it implied. It read, "The line is thinning. The boundary will not hold forever. When the last of them goes unmonitored, we will lose more than the family." I stared at that sentence longer than I should have. Because it didn't describe a threat coming from the family, it described a threat coming for them. And whatever it was, the agencies monitoring the lineage were terrified of it crossing back into our world. I didn't want to open the envelope at the bottom of the box. It was sealed with wax, real wax, the kind no government office has used in generations, and stamped with a symbol I'd seen only once before, on a document so deeply classified it might as well have been myth. The seal was cracked already, as if someone before me had tried to open it but lost their nerve. For a long moment I understood why. Some knowledge feels alive even before you read it, like it's pressing against the paper waiting for a host. Inside was a single letter, written in careful script on thick, almost fabric-like paper. No date, no signature, no address. Just a message written by someone who understood this family in a way no agency ever could. Someone who wasn't documenting them but warning whoever found this letter next. It began with a simple sentence. "You cannot save the last of them." The writer said the lineage was never meant to mingle with the rest of us. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were not finished. That phrase appeared again and again, not finished, as if the family had been incomplete from the moment they entered our world. As if something had interrupted the process of their creation, leaving them half-tethered to whatever place had existed before this one. The writer claimed that generations of observation, relocation, and containment weren't to protect society from the family, but to protect the family from being reclaimed. Reclaimed by what? The letter never named it, but the descriptions were enough to leave a cold knot forming behind my ribs. It spoke of a presence that moved along waterlines, following blood the way wolves follow scent. It described the sound it made. A low, harmonic vibration you don't hear as much as feel in your teeth. It said the earliest generations of the family knew this sound. Some longed for it, others feared it, but every one of them understood that once it was heard, it meant the boundary was weak. The writer claimed the government stepped in only when they realized the truth. They couldn't stop the presence, but they could keep it from finding its way home. The last paragraph was the hardest to read. The handwriting grew sharper, the ink darker, like the writer understood they were running out of time. They said the lineage had dwindled to just a handful of people scattered across the country, some hiding by choice, some hidden by force, and one, always one, who would eventually stop being monitored long enough for the presence to find them. The letter ended with a warning written so faintly it nearly vanished into the page. When the last of their line looks into still water and sees what is standing behind them, it will not be a reflection, and it will not be alone. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, closed the box, and I left that building without turning off the lights, without closing the basement door, without daring to look at my own reflection in the glass as I passed it. Because as I reached the exit, I felt something pressing against my thoughts. Not a voice, not a whisper, just a question that wasn't mine. How much of the line remains? And for the first time since I opened the first file, I understood why some families disappear. They're not lost, they're claimed.